And we're back. Welcome to a very special episode of American Restoration. This one is going to look different from anything you might have seen in the past, because, as my regulars know, I like to do these episodes as Dr. America, a character I've created. This one is far too serious for anybody to say, even jokingly, why should I take you seriously if there's so much kitsch behind you? And so I've chosen the most serious format in contemporary America, the PowerPoint. The reason this episode is so different is we're going to talk about the disenfranchisement of America, something that's been unfolding before our eyes for a matter of months. Got started with something very important, something that we've been talking about here. The Republic is in danger. Progressivism is a genuine threat to the future of America as a constitutional republic. And the threat is now palpable because you have been disenfranchised. What you got was election-themed theater. It was performance art for over 150 million people. This has been clear for months. The minute the Democrats began clamoring to change election rules and to flood the country with mail-in votes, it became impossible for us to hold a free and fair election. The structure of the 2020 presidential election was an invitation to fraud. You could see this happening before a single ballot was cast. What do we need to know? Well, there were about 90 million ballots distributed by mail. What does it mean when a ballot is distributed by mail? It means that there's almost no custodial oversight of those ballots. From the moment that they go out until the time that they come back in and get counted, we really have no idea where they've been, who's had access to them, who's touched them, who's filled them out. Now, there were about 160 million ballots cast. That means that over half the ballots were unprotected for a matter of weeks. No rational person would trust the integrity of a process when only half the ballots are protected. That means that this election lacked credibility before any votes were cast. The entire structure of the election was an invitation to fraud. All right, so the system was structured to invite fraud before the first ballot was cast. How do I know this? Because you'll notice that mail-in ballots is the answer given to every question you might ask, except one. Why couldn't we get the results election night? Mail-in ballots. Why have votes been straggling in for weeks? Mail-in ballots. How did Biden overcome Trump's margins late in the game? Mail-in ballots. How did a city like Milwaukee hit an 89% turnout rate, which is unheard of? Mail-in ballots. Why did the counting stop before it was done? Mail-in ballots. There's only one question you're not supposed to ask. Why was there far more fraud in 2020 than ever before in American history? Well, we all know the answer. Mail-in ballots. In fact, mail-in ballots and the rule changes that surrounded them were a clear invitation to fraud. The Democrats issued the invitation, then they accepted it. Let's take a look at what it means to have accepted that invitation. There were widespread rule changes made within months of the election. Many of them, by the way, made by officials who had no authority. But hey, this is 2020. Officials making decisions that have no authority is what we've seen all year. There was minimal custodial oversight of the ballots. Nobody knows what happened to them, where they went. There were anomalies in the turnout numbers, like we saw in Milwaukee and various other places. There were far fewer rejected ballots than usual. That's odd. You'd think that with that many mail-in ballots, there would be more than usual. Nope. Not only did we flood the country with ballots and leave them unwatched, but they almost all came back in a manner that was accepted. There was a rapid destruction of evidence capable of tracking ballots, particularly in places like Philadelphia, and I understand now in Georgia. They destroyed the signature envelopes before they could be matched. Now we've had reports of anomalous behavior during ballot counting. We know that there were anomalies like those pauses. There were anomalous data patterns shown up in the reported results. I've been contacted by data science. I've published a bit on some of the statistical anomalies. There's plenty of stuff out there. And here's the real kicker. If you've only got a lot of errors, if you've got incompetence, you would expect some would point one way, some would point another. But here, all anomalies point in the direction of the party that was most adamant about changing the rules and reducing ballot security. But we have a problem. Notions like obvious, rational, common sense, reasonable observer, anyone can see, these concepts have minimal significance as matters of law. We'll see in a minute why it's not no significance and where it can come in to be useful, but they have minimal significance as matters of law. In fact, the law presumes that government actions are valid unless proved otherwise. That means that ballots received and counted are presumed to be valid unless somebody can prove that they aren't. Now, we've got lots of precedents. Courts let people bring legal challenges over things like failure to check signatures or excluding observers in order to declare specific ballots invalid. But here's the kicker. These are mechanisms that are useful for providing retail fraud, knocking out small bunches of ballots at a time. They're poorly suited to proving wholesale fraud. And that's exactly what we had here. Wholesale strategic fraud in the places that it would do the most damage to the integrity of our election. So, what does matter to the legal process? First of all, let's note that pronouncement that no evidence was immediately available are either attempts to hide lies or a misunderstanding of evidentiary processes. People forget to ask follow-up questions. Election night, we already heard the media announcing there's no evidence of fraud. Well, the obvious follow-up is, okay, what would evidence of fraud look like? Suppose there were, at some point, a fraudulent election. What would you have expected to know by election night? Did there have to be videos of soldiers across the country intervening and interfering with people's voting? What could you have gotten there? The president's legal teams are working hard to assemble evidence relevant to assessing the likelihood of fraud. That takes time. And remember, each quantum of evidence is relevant to that determination. There doesn't have to be one smoking gun. Lots of little pieces add up. Many instances of individual or local fraud add up to a pattern of massive fraud. But no individual bit of evidence is likely to prove wholesale fraud, with the possible exception of computer fraud. But even computer fraud won't tell the entire story. It'll only tell an important part of it. At best, computer fraud is relevant to fraudulent tabulation of votes. It can account for the fraudulent paper votes. It can account for what was done with all the mail-in votes. So let's talk about evidence. Right? I like talking about evidence marshalling because it bridges between two of my worlds, legal reasoning and Bayesian probability. Now, we said that there is a presumption of validity, that government actions like ballots circulated and tabulated are assumed to be valid unless proved otherwise? Well, what that means is that before we saw any evidence, the probability that an election was valid is placed somewhere between even money and certainty. That's 0.5 and 1.0. That gives us what's known as a rebuttable presumption. If there's no evidence, we assume it was valid. If there is evidence, well, you can convince me that it's more likely than not to have been fraudulent. Now, here's where common sense may enter the legal equation. You can do that because the presumption doesn't tell us where between 0.5 and 1.0 the probability is set. Looking at things at common sense can help set the prior probability, the probability prior to assessing specific evidence, closer to 0.51, which means, a little bit more likely to have been valid than fraudulent, than to 0.99, which means, it was almost certainly valid. Every quantum of evidence consistent with fraud drives that probability lower. In order to prove systemic fraud, widespread fraud, wholesale fraud, we have to drive that probability below 0.5, posterior to or after we consider the evidence. Now, courts do not run through probabilistic calculations. At least most courts don't most of the time, even if they should. But they do conduct these analyses intuitively and informally. This is exactly the way that legal reasoning works. Now, what does evidence look like? Well, it can come in a couple of ways. First, there's witness testimony. Those are things that have been observed. Reports of observers getting blocked can't prove fraud, but they can make fraud a little bit more likely. Why? Because we're more likely to chase people away if we're doing something shady than if we're being honest. But that doesn't mean we're being shady. And the same is true with all other reports of election boards violating their own rules. All sorts of things. Destroying envelopes doesn't mean we're fraudulent, but we are more likely to destroy envelopes, signature envelopes, if we're frauds than if we're honest. You go down the line. Every one of these observations, every one of these deviations from the rules, every last minute change to the rules makes it more likely that we're looking at a fraud. Next, sworn affidavits count as evidence. If you know that there are a couple of hundred sworn affidavits, you can say that they're all a pack of lies, but you can no longer say that there's no evidence. Right? People are only allowed to talk about what they know, and even the most informed individuals are only going to know a small piece. So we need many, many affidavits to prove a pattern. Observations and testimony that say fraud is more likely drive the probability of validity lower. What about the fancy stuff? What about the statistics and the technology you keep hearing about? Well, statistical laws can detect anomalies. Data is generated by a process. Different processes tend to produce data that comes out in different patterns. When we see something that violates the expectations of that process, we can label it interesting. Statistically, those are called anomalies or outliers. Now, many things that are interesting are not problems. So statistics alone can't prove fraud, but they can tell you where to focus a fraud investigation. And here's what you need to understand. Even in a deeply fraudulent election, like the one we just had, most of the ballots were to have been fine, which means that most of the data is going to look okay. Let's make up some numbers, although I've heard them coming from people who don't have to make numbers. Let's suppose that there were 140 million ballots that were cast correctly and tabulated correctly. There were 10 million that were altered or lost, and there were 10 million that were just invented. Well, it means that 7/8 of the data is legitimate. So the pattern that you get from this fraudulent election is going to look a lot like the pattern you'd get from an honest election. But there will be holes in the data, there'll be gaps, and there will be bumps. And each of those gaps and bumps tells us that's a place to focus. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a problem, but it does mean that it's a place that you need to investigate. Every statistical anomaly that you notice drives the probability of validity lower. Now, computer fraud. How do we detect that? Code reviews, reverse engineering, testing, etc. If you're looking for overriding evidence of premeditated wholesale fraud, and you want to know how the biggest differences were made, this is where you would look. But, and this is critical, they don't tell the whole story, and they're not necessary to prove fraud. They would just make it much easier. These are all the pieces that the president's legal teams are putting together. Okay. Now, a couple of quick things to be warned about. First of all, what these legal teams are doing is unbelievable. It's marvelous. Right? Complex factual records take time to assemble. Remember, the Mueller team, who had as many resources as he wanted, tens of millions of dollars, a full staff, and 2+ years. Cases to break organized crimes, like those for which Rudy Giuliani is best known, take years of investigation to pull together a factual case. Right? Federal agencies are still working on fraud cases from the 2008 financial crisis 12 years later. And here we've given the president's team a few weeks to compile a complex factual record. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means, unquestionably, some of the leads will turn out to be unfounded rumors or dead ends. Next, the team will make mistakes. There will be things that get put in that shouldn't be put in. There will be data that looks strange because it was copied incorrectly. There will be affidavits taken from people who are completely unreliable. They will make mistakes. They will make mistakes because they're trying to do 2 difficult years' worth of work in 3 weeks. Anybody who's worked in litigation in any form knows what it takes to dot all your I's and cross all your T's. The president's team does not have time to dot any I's or cross any T's. So there's going to be a lot of error in there. Every time an error is spotted, the press is going to try to use it to shatter their credibility. Don't let them do it. If you have a couple of hundred affidavits, it doesn't matter if a few dozen of them are falsified. It certainly doesn't make things easier. It doesn't make you look good. But given the pressure and the timing under which these people are working, you can expect it. The same is true with statistical and computer arguments. Lots of things that sound exciting are going to turn out to be false. That's not the point. The question is whether enough of what they put forward is true to make a compelling case. Now, why do we need to make this compelling case, and to whom? That's the most important. America has lost control of its institutions. Most of America's institutions have become dangerously corrupt and dangerously progressive and dangerously anti-American. I've got a book coming out about this. It's called The New Civil War. Watch for its release in early 2021. I'm bringing it out with Real Clear Publishing. But if you want to understand how and why our institutions became so dangerously corrupt, this is where I tell the story. Bottom line, though, all of our institutions, media, academia, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Streets, most of the government, the entire Democratic Party, are focused on promoting an anti-American narrative and selling progressive ideology. They are not there to help us. And corporate America, well, it's committing suicide because it's paying protection money to progressives. That's another issue. I do some of that in my consulting work. But we have one institution that may be left standing. Is the Supreme Court the last holdout? Is the Supreme Court the last great American institution willing to stand for the American Republic? This is why I say all roads lead to the Supreme Court. The court has positioned itself as a defender of the Constitution since John Marshall. The most famous Supreme Court case in all of American history, Marbury versus Madison, is where Marshall said that it's up to the judiciary to determine what the law is and that the Constitution is superior to all law. From that day forward, the Supreme Court has positioned itself as the protector of the American Constitution. The Supreme Court, at the end of the day, will deal with one or more narrow legal rulings and specific evidence. And they'll issue a legal ruling. And no one will care about the specifics of that ruling. All that anybody wants to know is its immediate application. When that rule is applied to the current facts, who will America inaugurate next January? Now, the implications of their decision are even more important to determining who the president is, because the Supreme Court's ruling will determine whether the United States remains a constitutional republic, which it was founded to be, or the progressive transformation has succeeded and the United States has slipped into being an aristocracy. Now, aristocracy isn't necessarily the worst of things. It just means governance by an elite. So, if you're happy being governed by the folks who run social media companies and teach in our universities and run the media, and you trust them to make the right decisions all the time, well, then you might well be a progressive and you might be okay with an aristocracy. But that's not what the United States was founded to be. If the Supreme Court will not defend the Constitution's guarantee of a Republican form of government, if it will affirm the fraudulent elections will spell the end of the American Republic. We will no longer be a republic of its citizens. We will be an aristocracy in which different factions of the elite vie for power. So we've got two scenarios. The first one is the Supreme Court does the right thing and it stands strong for the Constitution. What happens? Well, Supreme Court will recognize and announce the fraud. Most important thing, because the media will immediately say that the Supreme Court has disenfranchised America. No. If the Supreme Court recognizes widespread wholesale fraud, it must tell American citizens that their election officials disenfranchised them. Because as I said at the opening, we have already been disenfranchised. What are the remedies? Well, if it's possible to disentangle the fraudulent ballots from legitimate ballots, order the disentanglement and see where things fall. Personally, I consider that extremely unlikely given the magnitude of the fraud. What do courts usually do when it's impossible to disentangle? Well, they order a new election. We saw one in New Jersey just this past summer. We saw one in North Carolina following the 2018 midterm elections. But that's not possible here. Here, the only possible remedy is nullifying the election in the challenged states, in which case the state legislatures and Congress would get to determine what happens as we go forward. What would happen is that Donald Trump would be inaugurated for a second term in January. Honest Democrats, and there are many, would see what their party had done, and they would join the call for major election reform to ensure the integrity of our future elections, and the U.S. would remain a constitutional republic. What if that doesn't happen? What if the Supreme Court falters, caves to the pressure, doesn't find enough fraud for it to matter, etc.? Well, if the Supreme Court joins the chorus of American institutions denying widespread fraud and affirming the reported results as if the election were free and fair, we're pretty much done. That means that we will have lost every single significant American institution. It means that going forward, we'll continue to see elections that use the same sorts of procedures we use this time. I mean, why not? If they've been ratified as ways of generating high voter turnout and free and fair elections, why not keep? And that will be the end of our free and fair election. Progressivism will succeed in transforming the United States into a corrupt aristocracy where Joe Biden, who will be inaugurated as the 46th president in January, will be a perfect figurehead. This is how it always works. You pick a guy who's got no personal future and who's got no independent support base, and you stick him up there while the folks in the background vie for power. In the true arc of history, all kinds of things happen. Republics fall, freedom is lost, welfare declines, injustices arise, dangerous ideology thrives, misery persists, until some very brave people rise to move life back to an uphill trajectory. Then when you get to the top of the hill, you can talk about the arc of history bending towards justice. Not until then. Either way, though, we've got a critical question. What can patriots do? Now, those of you who've been listening in the past know that I've been saying from day one that we're in the middle of a civil war and it's not going away after the election because they're not going to fold up and go away, and neither are we. We still don't know what the next phase is going to look like, but by January we will. If we remain a constitutional republic, we patriots have a lot of work to do. First of all, we need to reclaim our institutions. Just because we may prevail this time doesn't mean we'll continue to be lucky. If we do not reclaim our institutions from progressivism, we're just marking time. And once we do that, we also have to work to persuade the persuadables. There are a lot of people out there who think that progressivism is okay. There are tens of millions of people who voted for Joe Biden because they really believe that his nomination meant that the Democrats had defeated their progressive radicals. Personally, I think they were delusional. Doesn't matter. That's what they believe, and it means that we can persuade them to do better. Now, what if things don't break our way? What if we've lost the Supreme Court and we become a corrupt aristocracy? Well, then we can hold out hope that President Trump, on his way out the door, will declassify and publish everything relevant to understanding the fall of the American Republic. We can then do our best to marshal the newly public data and persuade people, galvanize the public to recognize that an elite aristocracy is exploiting them. And we can work with whatever institutions we still possess to defeat progressivism and win this civil war. Either way, we've got lots of work to do if we are to restore America. So here's a call out to all American patriots. Become an American restorationist. I know you've thought of yourself as conservatives for a long time, but we've lost our institutions. There is not much left to conserve. We have to restore it. And restorationism is a counter-revolutionary movement because the progressives, to a person, all think of themselves as revolutionaries. What does it mean to become a restorationist? Well, I've been writing about restorationism for a while. My slogan is defeat progressivism, win the Civil War, and restore America. I wrote about this a couple of years ago. You can read my book, American Restoration, Winning the Second American Civil War. It's available on Amazon. I'd also invite you all to watch and subscribe to this series, American Restoration with Dr. America. Soon, I hope to get back to the kitsch. They're more fun, they're more dynamic, and they're a lot shorter. But this one had to be what it had to be. You can follow me, Dr. America 5, or you can send me email, dr.america@dr-america.com. And please, if you want to develop educational materials, if you want to develop organizational or institutional strategies, corporate strategies, please do write to me and ask how you can succeed looking ahead in an America in the grips of a civil war. And of course, as I mentioned, I've got a new book coming soon called The New Civil War. Should be out in early 2021. That's it for today. I've gone a lot longer than usual. I've been drier than usual, and I've got PowerPoint instead of kitsch. Please do join us and subscribe. Please join the restoration movement. Become an American restorationist. Thanks.